Hello there, you beautiful people! My name is Willow, and welcome to this video about the Sanctuary Shattered Sun RTS project. That's a mouthful, but let's talk about it. Before we get into it, I want to state clearly that these are my opinions and it's okay to disagree with them. I'm going to be covering most, if not all, of what we know about the project so far, so sit back with a snack or drink and enjoy. Sanctuary is the next game taking a swing at replicating the success of Total Annihilation and Supreme Commander Forged Alliance and their simulated projectile style of real-time strategy. Before we get into specifics, I think we should explain what we mean by simulated projectile real-time strategy so we have some clarity. And to start explaining that, I think we need to take a look at non-SimPro RTS. From here out, we're going to use SimPro instead of simulated projectile. And we will start off with the big dogs in the room, Blizzard, with their Warcraft and StarCraft RTS games. So how do these games work? Well, it's somewhat simple, but also not at all. In these games, your units, with a few exceptions, looking at you, spellcasters, will always hit whatever you tell them to attack. If you right-click a Marine onto a Zergling, it will always, without fail or exception, attack and hit the Zergling. Kind of like the Marine is playing a first-person shooter with an aimbot while using a hit-scan gun. There is no random element involved with dealing damage, and it's all flat numbers. This is the traditional style of RTS. Most RTS you have played will work like this, although games of course tend to have outliers and exceptions to this rule, such as in Age of Empires, the projectiles are actually simulated, so therefore I'd consider it a SimPro game, but it doesn't get lumped in with the other SimPro games like FA, Planetary Annihilation, TA, Bar, and all of the others I don't pay attention to. Now we can take a look at SimPro RTS and explain how this works. In these games, every single weapon attack is simulated. If StarCraft 2 was a SimPro RTS, then when you select your Marine and right-click on a Zergling, it wouldn't be an aimbot with a hit-scan gun, but instead it would have to predict where the enemy unit will be and try and fire each burst of its rifle to hit the Zergling. In this situation, the Zergling could be moved out of the way of the projectile and take no damage in some scenarios. This, in a way, fundamentally changes how everything works. You have scenarios where units and weapons become more or less powerful based on how much your opponent micros their own units. You have situations where units will sometimes miss or even hit a unit they weren't aiming for because between the moment of their weapon firing and the projectile hitting, there's a chance for a change in positioning. So, in short, in a SimPro RTS, every projectile will be simulated, and variables in unit movement, targeting, and projectile speed all combine to lead to these messy and explosive fights where battles in the RTS can feel chaotic, and this, in my opinion, is the main draw that these RTS have, and the core reason why Forged Alliance is still played today over a decade since its original release. Now then, I think we've spent enough time explaining what we are talking about here, and can finally move on to the meat of today's topic, Sanctuary, and what we can expect to see and what it is attempting to pull off. Let's start off with talking about the people behind the project. The two big names we will be talking about here are Tatsu and 92. Hey! They rhyme. Quick, somebody get a Sanctuary rap in the works. Before we speak about them though, I want to say that I've worked with the Sanctuary team a bit, and it's filled with smart and talented people. They know what they're talking about, and it seems like they have a solid plan on how they are approaching development of this game. But moving on, we will start with Tatsu. Who is he? What does he do at Sanctuary? Well, his role at Sanctuary is being their financial manager. He deals with the money on the project, and most importantly is making sure they don't run out of it. Before Sanctuary, he was a web developer, and he is the original founder of the Sanctuary project, getting the entire project started, and since has become more of a manager than a developer on the project. The second man we need to talk about is 92. He is a full-stack developer who has experience managing risk on mid to large-size projects. He's already released a game on Steam called Bloodstream, and before joining Sanctuary, he was a big part of the Forged Alliance Forever community, making contributions such as the News Hub, being a community manager for Forged Alliance Forever, and the UI part of Forged Alliance Forever. When he joined Sanctuary, he made the original DOTS code and helped generate capital for the project. Nowadays, his key role is to manage risks for the project. Now that we know the who, we need to know the why. Why would Tatsu and 9-2 put so much on the line to try and make such a huge project? Well, the answer is twofold from what I understand: passion and ambition. We will come back to the ambition side of this later, as it's a big part of this game, but the simple answer to why they are running the Sanctuary project is passion. Both of them loved Forged Alliance, and both want to see a modern iteration on the base concepts that Chris Taylor envisioned back in 2007. So after only 1,000 words, we can finally start to talk about the topic of this video: Sanctuary. I find it hard to figure out where I want to start with this game, as there's so much to unpack, but I guess we should start with the beginning. What is the premise of the game? Sanctuary Shattered Sun is a game set in a future where humanity has achieved one of the greatest accomplishments imaginable for a stellar civilization: the construction of a Dyson sphere. You may have heard about this concept, as over the past few years, this idea kind of exploded into popular culture. To give a quick description of it, a Dyson sphere is basically the most ambitious power generator imaginable. It's a structure built around a star designed to capture most or all of its energy to generate power. The power generated by a Dyson sphere is unimaginable, more than 1 trillion times what we produce today, but that wasn't the main reason it was built. Humanity was running out of space, and a Dyson sphere was a solution to this problem, as it provided an incredible amount of space to house humanity well into the future and promised a bright future for everyone. Sanctuary was supposed to be a true Garden of Eden, constructed by a super advanced AI named Ra, who served as its caretaker. It had everything humanity would need, from climate control to day-night cycles to a full atmosphere. It was as close to a utopia humanity would ever get. So, naturally, there's a war being waged on this colossal structure, because if there's one thing we know about humanity, it's that we can't get along. Moving on to the factions at play, we have the Earth Defense Alliance, or EDA for short, the Chosen, and the Guard. Starting off with the Earth Defense Alliance. They are a benevolent dictatorship who believes in humanity's supremacy and sovereignty over Sanctuary. Moving on to the Chosen, they are a group of transhumanists who have uploaded their minds and consciousnesses into a computer substrate and effectively ascended their mortal bodies. They've become synthetic humans living with no fears of disease or old age, and this led them to changing their values and priorities away from physical things to align more with placing value in ideas and concepts. These digital individuals took up jobs in administration and governance, but over time, as the Chosen started monopolizing these positions, resentment grew within the human populace. The EDA wanted human representation in powerful positions, while the Chosen felt humanity required their guidance to flourish. When disaster struck and the moon crashed into Sanctuary, both the EDA and Chosen were quick to blame each other for the catastrophe. With this, the broiling tensions erupted into all-out war. This brings us to the Guard. They are a group of AIs created by Sanctuary's caretaker Ra, after he determined that the only way to stop damage to Sanctuary was through direct intervention. The Guard's mission is to protect Sanctuary by pacifying both factions by any means necessary. So now we understand the premise, setting, and furthermore, the motivations behind each faction. Let's move on to what the game looks like and how it's going to work. Let's start talking about the game itself. Sanctuary is being created on the Unity engine. I find this really interesting, as I know the Unity engine is incredibly powerful and versatile, but I've never played a real-time strategy developed on the engine. This choice is honestly a bit out of my depth, as I can't even begin to tell you the differences in game engines and how they operate, but I can say that they put a lot of thought into it, and in the end, I'm not sure the engine really matters. What I can speak to is their choice of trying to make a true spiritual successor to a game that sold over 1 million copies and is a cult classic that has stood the test of time. That goal is ambitious, and ambition really is a double-edged sword. It can lead to overstretching and setting goals that are unattainable that could spell failure, but at the same time, ambition can drive you to create something better than you would have if you were playing it safe. Some of the best games you ever played were ludicrously ambitious for their time. For now, we will have to wait and see exactly exactly how the sword of ambition will sway. Will Sanctuary shoot for the moon and land in the stars, or crash and burn in the atmosphere? Only time will tell, but there's a lot going for the team, and I want to stress that they are not amateurs running around in the dark. I have the privilege of having been able to see a bit more into the development of Sanctuary than the public, and while I cannot share specifics, I will say that the team on this project has a very clear and defined direction that they are working for, and they are working every day to get closer to their end goals. Continuing to talk about how the game will work, I'm going to go through some of the key features about the game to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Let's start off with the big one we already covered. The game is going to have fully simulated projectiles. If you see something flying through the air, it will be its own unique entity and can hit, miss, or find unintended targets. Moving on to the next key feature, this game is going to be a grand scale strategy game. The maps are going to be accurately sized to the real world and go as big as 40 by 40 kilometers or 81 by 81 Supreme Commander kilometers, because scaling is a joke in that game, and you will be able to field a force of 1,000 strong for each player. This means the game is going to be very macro focused. Sure, you could micro one unit and try to get the absolute most out of it, but if you aren't able to replace that unit with another 2 or 3 when it inevitably dies, then you will have been wasting your time. The next key feature will be the classic strategic zoom the genre is known for. In most RTS, you are limited by your camera, but in Sanctuary, you won't be. You will be able to zoom out and see the entire map and give orders from that view, while also being able to zoom in on the smallest engagements for finer control. Lastly, the game is going to be featuring a true flux economy. It attempts to mimic real life. You know how in StarCraft, when you go to build a marine, you need all the materials up front? Well, that's not how the real world works. Think about it for a second. If you need to build a building, do you have to wait for all of the construction materials to arrive before you can start clearing the land and digging the foundation? Of course not. You start immediately, and as you work, more construction materials are brought to the site as you progress. In Sanctuary, you will be able to do just that, with everything from building structures to units to Dyson Sphere destroying massive robots. So these are the key features, the core aspects of the game, and what will guide all the decisions made by the dev team. These are the end goals that they have set for themselves to reach. But they aren't the only goals. Moving on, I want to talk about the unique features that have been revealed and promised by Sanctuary if their Kickstarter is successful. Having covered the core principles of the game, let's jump into some of the things Sanctuary is doing, which will be unique, that we haven't seen before. Now, I want to preface these sections by mentioning that most of these features are dependent entirely on whether the Kickstarter and/or funding goals are met. So keep in mind that all of these features, or none of them, may make it into the game you buy in the future. We'll start off with the first feature that's been revealed, sphere damage. The idea of this is to play into the lore of Sanctuary and turn it into a unique but somewhat rare gameplay mechanic. As we spoke about earlier, all of the fighting is being done on a Dyson Sphere that encapsulates the sun. This brings about a really cool idea in my opinion. What if you bring something so destructive it breaks the Dyson Sphere open? You blow a hole through this, relatively speaking, thin veil that is the only thing protecting you from being turned into some crispy bacon. Well, this is what the devs over at Sanctuary are planning to bring to the game. As far as I understand it, this will not be a very common occurrence, and a weapon strong enough to do this level of damage is going to be extremely expensive, but the idea of being able to change the map through gameplay is quite fun, and while some RTS in the past have tried it, like Planetary Annihilation and the planet-destroying weapons, Sanctuary's seems to be very unique. Imagine you are fighting a huge battle and losing, badly, and in your desperation right before the enemy comes crashing through the gates, you use a sphere-breaking device to literally take the ground out from under them. It sounds awesome, and like a cool mechanic to play around with, but I have some worries, and I think now is as good a time as any to air them. The key issues I see with this mechanic are threefold: cost, limitations, and game balance. We will start off with the cost. Of course, anything this absurdly powerful absolutely 100% should be so expensive as to make it an all-in strategy. Even if these weapons can only destroy a small portion of the map, let's say 5%, that needs to be balanced by the cost to obtain the weapon. I think I speak for everyone when I say that it's incredibly boring to watch and play a game where fighting is discouraged. And this could be one huge way to discourage a fight, as even if you win, you lose. In my opinion, this should be closer to a win harder kind of feature than a desperation tactic. If you are economically ahead but can't break the enemy, then using this to get the opening you need would be awesome. But if it's obtainable when you are already losing, that just leads to stagnation because neither side will want to take a fight due to the ever-present sword of Damocles that this weapon is. Moving on to my next worry, we have limitations. This weapon should by all accounts be limited, and by a ton in my opinion. A few ideas of limitations I can throw out that would be lore friendly would be having players' bases be designated as reinforced. All the factions would know how the sphere was built and its strong and weak points. This weapon and mechanic shouldn't be able to just destroy someone's base with no counterplay. The areas safe from sphere damaging events and weapons should be clearly indicated and explained. This makes it easier to plan around and gives you some form of combating the sphere damage mechanic if you don't have access to it yourself. And my last worry is of course game balance, which is a mix of the other two. This needs to be balanced extremely well, otherwise it will be more harmful than good to the overall gameplay. Limitations and costs are the means by which you can balance this. If its cost is so prohibitive, it will mean that it will happen more rarely, but it will be better than a cheap tactic that no one enjoys dealing with. If its limitations are done well, it will be a powerful but not game-ending tactic that has no counterplay. Look at FA for guidance. If you build a Maver, does it automatically win you the game? No, but it makes winning the game much easier. That's how this should work. So overall, I'm both excited and nervous about this feature. I think it's unique and interesting, but that doesn't mean good. It could be one of the coolest mechanics in an RTS ever, or just a disappointment, or even worse, could detract from the game. Keeping with the theme of being able to interact with and change a map through gameplay, we have the weather system feature. First, let's get into the lore of why this system could exist. Sanctuary was made to be what its namesake describes, somewhat of a utopia for mankind. This perfectly constructed world that was entirely man-made, meaning pretty much everything is artificial, the weather included. The core concept behind this system is that on some maps you will find weather control stations in neutral territory that can change the climate of the local area of the sphere. Think of it as the mother of all thermostats. This will allow players to change the map they are fighting on drastically. Just imagine it. You start off on this sandy desert of a map, but you're like Anakin, and you don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating and gets everywhere. Well, unlike the prequels, you can change that. You can take control of this weather control station and turn the map into a frozen tundra or a more alpine or arid climate. Isn't modern science wonderful? So now we know what the feature is roughly. Let's talk about it. This one has a lot of the same issues I brought up with the sphere damage topic. On the surface, it could seem useless, but on maps where there is water, it could be a disaster. You could invest a huge amount of economy into Navy and have it all rendered nearly useless due to the enemies freezing all the water, trapping your ships, turning them into very expensive point defense, all the while they were building up a huge land army that now gets to walk up on your Navy, negating its range advantage, and march into your base. Now, if you are in a certain crowd, you could just say, "It's your fault for building Navy knowing this is a possibility." But you are just wrong. Players shouldn't have to fear about investing into units, in my opinion. So overall, I think the same about this as I do with the sphere damage system. It could be amazing and awesome, but at the same time, it could be horrible. I also want to state that they mentioned it will not be on every map, so this may be a non-issue where if it is implemented badly, players just won't play maps with this feature enabled. But overall, this feature also comes down to cost and limitation. It needs to have some sort of cost that is significant, as well as be limited. Maybe the weather can only change once per game, but overall, it needs to have great warning for the opposing team. It should never never be a surprise that they are changing the weather. And with that, let's move on to the next feature. Oh, also, there's another feature that I want to talk about, but it would be a lot of repeating myself. There's going to be a destructible environment where bridges can be destroyed as well as repaired, and things like cities with buildings that can be damaged or destroyed. This one has little to talk about since it's not nearly as vast or sweeping on the game itself as the other two, but this one I think is a good idea, and I don't see much issue with it as it isn't going to be something that is permanent or extremely impactful overall, while also adding unique situations to the game. Moving on, the next feature is honestly one of the most exciting ideas I've seen from the team, and it's called the chassis system. So right now we will use FA as an example just to talk about how it will work. Right now, when you load into a game of FA, you get your ACU. That ACU is pretty much going to be the same unit throughout the entire game. Sure, it may get upgrades that turn it into a borderline experimental, but overall, its functions are exactly the same as any other ACU, just with different numbers and abilities. Sanctuary wants to approach this differently. The King Piece, otherwise known as the command unit, is going to be very malleable. The unit itself will of course always start the game the same, but they plan to have ways to change the unit and its function entirely from both a visual and gameplay perspective. Maybe you need a big beefy frontline unit to help you break a position. Well, you will take your King Piece to an upgrade center, and you can trade out the base chassis and replace it with a heavy walker that has more HP and bigger guns while being much slower. And maybe later on in the match you find that you want to use your commander to help with your navy. Well, that's no problem. Head over and switch to a hover tank chassis and go out and conquer the seas. Each chassis is going to have its own upgrades, but unlike FA, there will only be a few to choose from, as the chassis itself is almost like choosing an upgrade. Also, the examples I threw out aren't necessarily going to be in the game, I'm just letting my imagination run wild and thinking up cool chassis ideas. Honestly, I have trouble criticizing this idea. All of the other feature reveals leave me with doubts in the back of my mind or make me nervous about creating stagnant or unfun gameplay, but this one just excites me. I'm a huge fan of using your most important unit in a risky way. I love high risk and high reward gameplay, and this system can cater to me while also allowing the more reserved players to play the way they want. If you don't want to risk your King Piece, then don't. You don't have to invest into it if you don't want to, and can spend those resources elsewhere. Honestly, if there's one feature that I'm crossing my fingers to see in the game, it's this one, and luckily I don't have to worry, as Tatsu has confirmed this will be in the game no matter what. You want to know what else is already guaranteed to be in the game? The final feature. This feature reveal I want to talk to you about is called Second Wind. I've mentioned this before in my full share versus no share video, and I spoke my piece on it then, and I'll repeat myself here. I think this system can be incredibly great or horrible. But what is it? Well, the name kinda describes it all. It's basically death protection for the King Piece. Take a bad fight or overextend alone with the King Piece? Well, it's not necessarily the end of your game, because Sanctuary plans to implement a system wherein your King Piece goes dormant the first time it gets reduced to 0 HP, and gives you a chance to use your units and maybe ally support to save it from danger. As with everything else, there aren't too many specifics on how it will work, but in theory, it's a great way to negate some of the less fun gameplay we see in similar titles. It's not really all that fun to snipe or be sniped. Sure, it's tense and makes for some good casting sometimes, but overall, it's a weird interaction unique to these style of games. When someone is sniping, they just throw a bunch of resources into either air units or some other weapon, and then they right-click on the King Piece and pray. There isn't much skill expression or really all that much you are doing other than trying to hide it. And when you are getting sniped, you either saw it early, preempted it, and countered it before it ever got to you, or you micro your commander furiously in a vain hope that you can cheat death. Overall, it's not that fun compared to microing huge armies or having battles with massive robots like it's Gundam or Pacific Rim. So with that being said, you probably expect me to praise the idea and call it a great innovation. Well, you're wrong, because I can see how a system like this could be cancerous. Let's talk about it. Yes, This system will prevent my personal least favorite tactic in FA, but at the same time, it has implications on the rest of the game. I think it's actually bad for a lot of situations. One in particular is overextending. I think that if a player overextends, they should be punished, but this system, paired with a chassis system, could encourage some very annoying gameplay, where you get a strong assault chassis before popping second wind, send it in and micro your heart out. Once the second wind activates, you rush in with an army you've been stockpiling, and as long as you win the fight, you just abuse the second wind mechanic to win a fight that you should have lost. There is an argument to be made that losing second wind was you being punished, but what if you can regain second wind with an upgrade? But even if you can't regain it, you still have issues. A lot of games can be decided off of one big engagement. If you use it to win the engagement, and then you get a big reclaim field as well for winning the engagement, then you got paid for overextending on purpose. And yes, there's an argument to be made that this is just playing the game by its rules and you are using every resource at your disposal, but we will have to wait and see if this mechanic is fun to play with or against. I'm here because I love the idea of Sanctuary because of how much fun I have with FAF and Bar. I'm not worried about it being fair or perfectly balanced. I want the game to encourage fun interactions instead of tedious or boring ones. For now, I'm hopeful for this feature, as I said. It could be amazing or horrible. I like to think positively, so until I see a reason otherwise, I'm going to say it will most likely be a good addition to the game. In closing, I think that Sanctuary is a very ambitious project. I mentioned it in the beginning, and most of the things I brought up here are very ambitious goals. Trying to live up to a title that sold over 1 million copies, trying to innovate and create something amazing that still represents the core foundation they took inspiration from. Ambition is the defining feature of Sanctuary. It's what's running through its veins. There's a famous saying, shoot for the moon and land in the stars. Well, I believe Sanctuary is going to land in the stars, but there's a caveat to that. Sanctuary is going to be running a Kickstarter in 2023. This Kickstarter will decide a lot of things that will change what game we get when it launches. The team working on Sanctuary is no doubt delusional, out to lunch, off their rocker, but it's crazy people like them with a vision and a plan that create some of the best things we've ever experienced. So I'll end this video by saying, if you are someone who watched through this video, then you most likely are familiar with FAF, BAR, TA, or PA. Oh, and maybe some of you 0K guys are kicking around too, I don't know. And I know that a lot of you want a new game. With the exception of BAR and PA, our games are old. And BAR, at its core, is a copy of TA, so you all are just new old anyways. I love you, BAR team. And with these games being old, there's a very common thread. People want a new game to come along and wow them the way that these games did years ago. We all want to experience that awe and wonder that our games gave to us. If you want that, then the answer isn't to tear down people who try and do it. It's not to call the game an FA clone. It's not to say, I don't know about this project because X, Y, or Z. The Sanctuary team has stated their goals, and those goals are to create the next game in this genre. If the idea of that excites you, then you should consider helping when the Kickstarter comes along, because delusion and a dream can only take you so far when making games. Thank you all for watching this video. You are so beautiful. Thank you to the Patreons and channel members who support me. You all are amazing. If you want to deep dive into any of these topics, comment down below and let me know. This is Willow, signing off.